Okay, let's get going. Welcome to the first event of the Scottish Revival Network, and thank you very much for coming along. I'm Dr. Scott Lyle, Associate Professor in Modern and Scottish Literature at Edinburgh Napier University, and I lead the network with Dr. Michael Shaw, Lecturer in Scottish Literature at the University of Stirling, and Dr. Jim Benstead, the Research Assistant for the network, also of Edinburgh Napier University. So there's going to be a series of events over the next 2 years in this network looking at different aspects of the revivals in Scottish literature and art from around 1880 to around 1950. So I guess broadly the modernist period. And you can check out what we've got planned on our website, which you can find at revival.scot. And you can also find us on Twitter at @ScotRevival. Today's event asks from various perspectives, what is revival? And hopefully we'll be able to provide some suggestions. How today's event will shape up? Well, firstly, we'll hear a brief summary of the key ideas from each of our panelists' recorded talks. Then we'll go straight into a roundtable discussion of some of the issues and ideas emerging from those talks before we have an audience Q&A. At the Q&A, and I'll remind you of this once we get to the Q&A, you can type your questions into the Q&A link on Zoom. And if selected, we will read those out for you. Or if you would like to talk, you can raise your hand and we will bring you into the discussion. Just some housekeeping notes before we start. This event is being recorded, but it's only the panelists who are on video. Please keep your mics off unless you're invited to talk. If you want to turn off the live transcript, if you're seeing that at the bottom of the screen, you can do so at the bottom right of your screen. And if you need a hand with anything technical, please type your question in the chat and Jim will be able to pick that up. Okay, I'm going to introduce our lovely panelists now, and I'll come first to Dr. Alex Thomson, who is a senior lecturer in English literature and head of department at the University of Edinburgh. And Alex's talk examined ideas and theories of revival. So I'll invite Alex to summarise that talk briefly for us now.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And I'd like to just begin by thanking Michael and Scott for developing what I think is a much needed project and inviting me to contribute. And thank you too to the other panelists for fascinating talks. And thanks to everyone who made it through the video. I will keep this brief and summarize my thinking just in case you didn't. And I want to preface it with all the usual caveats, really work in progress, thinking things out. So as I highlighted in my video, it seems to me to be very difficult, almost impossible, to think about modern and contemporary Scottish literature, art and culture without invoking the idea of revival in some way, shape or form. And certainly personally, in the past, that's made me very impatient with a category that seems to assume as given so much about the relationship between art and its social environment. So I'm kind of using this project as a way to kind of overcome my own impatience and try to find a more critical, detached approach, and hopefully that allows for a kind of more even-handed evaluation of the different forms, modes and approaches associated with Scottish revival. So I just got 3 assumptions to work through. The first assumption that I make is that the idea of cultural revival is a highly portable trope for narrativizing historical experience. So you can basically find it anywhere you want to find it. And that explains why there's a kind of infinite regress. And I think Charlotte touched on this in her video, that whenever someone says, oh, we need a revival, you look back and 10 years earlier, someone else is going, oh, we need a revival. So it doesn't actually tell us very much about what's going on, frankly. So why is it so kind of pervasive and so powerful? Well, my answer is that it provides a way of linking an axiology, i.e. a set of values, within the artistic or literary field. So something which sets criteria for judgment, including references to tradition or exemplars or innovation, which ties to justification narratives in the social and political sphere. So my second assumption is that to understand not just the power, why people have kind of kept reaching for this trope, but what its function is in framing particular situations. And that's not just a kind of literary historical issue, but it's factored into the production of works of art as well. I think we have to recognize several things. So for me, we have to emphasize that it's a forward-looking rather than backward-looking project, and that the relevant contrast or distinction to be drawn is within different forms of modernist impulse rather than between tradition and modernism. And this makes artistic revival completely compatible with innovation in science and the other arts, which is something that Michelle captured directly in talking about the Geddes' Renaissance. And for me, the reference to traditional authority is not only compatible with the idea of the modern in art, but indispensable to it. And thinking about the talk, I realized that I think about the history of modern art as essentially a continuous history of revivals, and that we're very familiar with the alternation of a kind of classicist and a vernacular revival, but the choice between these alternatives, I think, to get to the heart of revival, is to see that as secondary to the force of revival as a kind of temporalizing logic. And I think that becomes clearest in its avant-garde versions. So for example, if you think about MacDiarmid, to me, he sees his kinship with T.S. Eliot or Wyndham Lewis, not in the specific set of cultural values that he's advocating, but in the fact that the way that revival works is premised on rupture rather than continuity. So it introduces discontinuity and critique as a starting point for a new kind of orientation. And then finally, my third assumption, which I introduced to try and contextualize cultural revival as a broader theme with reference to a particular period, what I take to be just the age of modernism in very banal terms, 1850s to 1950. And I suggested here that the key idea is the Renaissance of Renaissance. So what I'm arguing there, I think, is that what defines the difference between modern art as a history of revivalism and cultural revival in this specific period is its self-recognition as a kind of culture of recognition. And actually, Michelle's image of Michael Scott is a great example of this, that they're looking back to Scott as a translator and a cultural revivalist. And that's the key thing here. And I was thinking about this today, and I realized that there's a comment somewhere from Paul de Man who writes about how many people thinking about cultural history keep reinventing Hegel without having read him properly. And I realized that basically that's what I've done there. And then finally, the critical category for me in making this distinction is the idea of culture itself, i.e. as the congruence of literary, artistic, linguistic, institutional or social boundaries. And specifically, my example here very quickly would be, if you think about the way Edwin Muir writes about Edinburgh in his Scottish Journey, the ugliness that he sees is symptomatic of the kind of non-integration or non-harmonious world. So as soon as he says, you know, this is a really ugly piece of land, of kind of urban landscape, he's drawing with him all of this complicated web of cultural assumptions, which we need to kind of distance from to understand them. And it's this kind of, this sort of vertical integration of different social spheres, which allows for change, whether it's claimed, wished for in one sphere, to be taken as paradigmatic or symptomatic of change in another. And as with Muir, the specific and recurrent tendency for our period would be art standing for culture as a whole, or the use of artistic aesthetic categories to critique the social world. And that's what I'm guessing, feeling, my hunch, is that this is what distinguishes revival in this period from a much older idea of the recovery of a specific tradition, e.g. a tradition of eloquence. So that's me.
Thank you very, very much, Alex. A lot to unpack there, but we'll move on to our next speaker. Charlotte Lauder is a PhD student at Strathclyde University, examining Scottish magazines between 1870 and 1920, and her talk looked at magazines and the Scottish revival. So Charlotte, if you would summarise some of your main points, please, for us.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And thanks also to Michael and Jim for organising this. I realised I didn't actually thank anybody at the beginning of my video, which makes me look very sort of petulant, but I'm really thankful to be here. So yeah, I just wanted to get that in early. I'm going to be incredibly concise, which I'm quite bad at, and summarise also 3 points that kind of came out of my talk. The first is just quite an open statement that we know very little really about magazines of that 1870 to 1920 period, that pre-Renaissance kind of era, and partly because magazines are underappreciated or they've been slightly neglected in favour for other resources, but also because magazines are so multifaceted and they do so many different things at one time. They try to appeal to people and then they also try not to appeal to people. So it's always a kind of ongoing discussion. Secondly, there is an awareness, I think, in of revival in these magazines, although after having seen Alex's video, I'm slightly less convinced by that now. But nevertheless, there is some instances or relationship with revival in magazines in maybe a different way, I think, to what Michelle and Corey kind of outlined, where I think both of their videos showed that there were people doing revival, aware that revival was happening, and then also aware of what that revival meant. But for myself in these magazines, I'm finding it more difficult to kind of find the right people, find what they said about revival, and then try and distill that. So that's my summary. It's being worked into a chapter, so any feedback that I get today is most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for that. Our next panellist is Dr. Corey Gibson, who is lecturer in modern and contemporary Scottish literature at the University of Glasgow. And Corey's presentation looked at the links between the folk revival and the Scottish Renaissance. So if you would summarise some of your main points for us now, Corey, please.
Grand, thanks very much, Scott. And thanks to Michael and Jim for having me along and for setting this all up. Thanks to the other panellists as well. I want to offer a couple of wee caveats to echo Alex, that my contribution to the panel today is drawn from old work of mine that I've done on Hamish Henderson, but also trying to reach towards some new sort of nascent projects. So in my contribution, I start trying to tease out some of the connections between the post-war Scottish folk revival, which is a kind of a popular and diffuse kind of cultural revival, as compared to the interwar literary Renaissance. And in my own work, the way I've established of trying to compare these two movements is through Hamish Henderson and Hugh McDiarmid, not least because they were in such direct sort of collaboration and a kind of publicly performed antagonistic relationship as well, not least on the value of folk arts and popular culture as opposed to avant-garde cultural production and vanguardist political views of McDiarmid's. So they make for a really interesting combination there, not least also because I think someone like Henderson belongs to a kind of modernist approach to these problems that Alex briefly summarized and explored in more detail in his talk, but at the same time is kind of seen as a strategist on behalf of a popularly oriented folk revival. And so he's trying to square that circle in really interesting ways. And in the ways in which he fails to do that are sort of the reason for his significance and interest for our purposes, I would suggest. So I've done a lot of that kind of work before. I wanted to sketch out some of those connections, but I also opened with a couple of thoughts on the 1948 big public event marking the 25th anniversary of John Maclean's death, which saw figures of the literary Renaissance meet with figures of the then nascent popular folk revival, meeting on a stage there to celebrate this kind of radical tradition, and then meeting again 25 years later to mark the 50th anniversary of John Maclean's death. So there's a kind of, I mentioned in the talk, kind of a poetic irony there, that risks are seeing this as a thing that feeds into these ideas of perpetual decline and revival that Alex talked about as well, right? That we can only revive these things to memorialize a radical past rather than sort of advancing those causes, if you like. I also then tried to talk about some of the other ways in which we might make connections between the post-war revival and the interwar Scottish literary Renaissance, not least through some literary figures who span those movements, figures like Joe Corey or Mary Brooksbank, but also scholars like F. Marion McNeill. And I came at this with some recent sort of archival work on the Chapbook magazine by Arthur Argo, which is the sort of main magazine for the folk revival in the post-war period, and it contains a lot of the kinds of assumptions that are now commonplace in Scottish cultural history and Scottish literary critical history around popular culture, folk culture, and its proximity to the kind of cutting edge of literary arts in Scotland. So there are conceptual connections, there are individuals who span both of these movements. And I also sketched out some of the ways in which I think the success of the popular success of the folk revival is kind of a mirror image of many of the sort of planned for failures of the literary Renaissance, at least in Hugh McDiarmid's terms, right, in terms of its popular reach and its political impact and everything. And so I think it can be positioned quite interestingly in our cultural history as something that sits between that interwar avant-garde project and a devolutionary period of kind of vernacular politics as well. I then ended with a couple of wee thoughts on some of the things I'm interested in trying to excavate now and in the future, and trying to look specifically at what writers across our period do with folk culture in Scotland, because I think it's often a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced than some positions in our sort of critical history would suggest. It's often more than just a kind of touchstone to try and borrow some authority from an inherited past, for instance. And that was me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Corey. And our fourth panellist is Dr. Michelle Foote, who is lecturer in 19th century art at the University of Edinburgh, and her talk concerns spiritualism in Celtic revival art. So if you would summarise your key points for us, please, Michelle.
Hi everyone. Thank you as well to Scott and Michael for inviting me to be here. Really excited to be on this panel. And thank you to everyone who is attending today. And I just want to also apologise that my camera didn't connect to the recording. I'm so sorry I didn't appear on that. So my paper really looked at the role of the past within the Celtic and looked at some of the details or nuances of a case study that drew out some of the broader themes of revival as well, particularly how perceptions of the past heightened ideas about cultural identity, and how connecting with the past, whether real, augmented, or invented, located characteristics within Scottish cultural identity, such as magic and enchantment as part of the spiritual or perhaps supernatural facet of Celticism. And I looked at how spiritualism, a contemporary movement with the Celtic revival, noted these aspects of Celticism and seemingly appropriated them into their own discourses about mediumistic identity, which in turn offered conceptual opportunities that attracted Celtic revivalists and provided revivalist artists, in this case, John Duncan, with a means of conveying connections with the past, using spiritualist ideas and iconography to visualize those connections. So in the case study, that was the way in which Aristotle appears like a spirit guide to the wizard and scholar of Michael Scott in the Ramsey Lodge common room murals, showing the passage of knowledge and wisdom from an ancient past to a medieval past to the Victorian present. So how connecting the past, or a usable past, as Alex described in his paper, as a process of revival that was intended to benefit the future. And it's this notion of progressing to the future that I didn't really get to develop as part of this case study, but I think that element of progression towards the future, perhaps utopian ideals that come up within that, is something that will inevitably appear in our discussion or indeed in later events of this network. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So we'll move on now then to our roundtable discussion. Thank you very much, all four of you, for what were fascinating talks, great recordings, and I think lots of ideas and issues emerged from these, and I think the talks kind of worked together really well. There were two main themes that struck me that came out of the four talks. One, perhaps most obviously, revival's relationship with unconstruction and deconstruction of the past, and also revival's somewhat ambivalent relationship with popular culture and popular forms. So I'll try and dig in maybe to the first idea as we start, revival in relation to the past. And Michelle, I'll probably start with you actually, and your kind of wonderful talk relating spiritualism to Celtic revival art, particularly the case study of John Duncan's Michael Scott mural. This sense of spiritualism, I think, seeking to bring the past alive. I mean, with spiritualism, that's almost a kind of resurrection of the dead, really, isn't it, in a way? one of the things I thought was fascinating about the mural is the presence of a very muscular Aristotle there, suggesting some sort of connection to the Greek classical world. And presumably through that also a connection to the Renaissance revival of the classical past. So I just wondered if you could talk about that, maybe a bit. Whose pasts are being resurrected by the Celtic revival, and what might be the connection between that Greek classical world represented by Aristotle, and where does Scotland sit in relation to that in that mural?
It's a really good question. I think what's quite striking there is that it's maybe conscious of much broader revivals, particularly artistic revivals. So even thinking back to this sort of Neoplatonic strain and the wider sort of referring back to ancient philosophies that give particularly Western culture these opportunities to continue reviving. So looking at the Italian Renaissance and perhaps trying to replicate some of that in the Celtic revival itself. So giving a platform there for some of these broader philosophical currents to also find purchase within the imagery that's coming out of the Celtic revival in Edinburgh, but also more broadly in places like Glasgow. I think it's quite interesting that there's a muscular element to it as well, which shows that there is perhaps something of the Celtic revival trying to find something idiosyncratic while still tapping into these broader spiritual revivals that are also Neoplatonic to some extent, such as spiritualism, which tends to put an emphasis on the feminine. I wonder if there is something more distinct going on within the imagery that John Duncan's using in that particular mural, that it does seem very masculine. And if there is something going on there, I don't know what that is yet. This is still very new research for me as well. And whether or not that helps to perhaps entrench some sort of authority, particularly within the Victorian context. Or if indeed there is, these elements of, is there behind that an element of something being quite feminine in the sensitivity of this particular Scottish character that is able to channel Aristotle? I don't think that's answered your question. I think I've gone off on a tangent there.
No, it's fascinating. I think the femininity stuff, I suppose, brings us on to Arnold. But before maybe coming on to that, I wanted to kind of bring in Alex there, because the mural in a way kind of slightly reminded me of something Alex said in his talk about a revival being the Renaissance of Renaissance. I just wondered if Alex could comment maybe a bit on what he meant by that, because it seemed to kind of signify some of what was in that mural in a sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's my, and again, I think that's why I need to think through and kind of, this is where you have the footnote in your paper going, okay, find the sources for this. But I think it's my sense, and I think we've all kind of flagged this, that it's the difference is the self-consciousness of revival, and it's revival as a kind of mending of something. So I'm struck by the fact that we all talked about progress and moving forward. And obviously that seems paradoxical given that where we start with revival is repetition. And there's something really potentially powerful going on there, that it's and I love that idea of the mural literally being present there, but it's showing this kind of chain of kind of cultural transmission. But that's only necessary because there's a problem, there's an interruption. And Michelle, I thought you had so many fantastic examples of this, of that idea of materialism, rationality, spiritualism. It's kind of counterfeiting. And in some ways, what you were showing us was why revivalism has been so unpopular in kind of reputable Scottish cultural history, because it appears to embrace cultural mythologies, the Celticism, a kind of romanticization of the past, and it appears to set Scotland on the other side of history and modernity. So that tension, that dynamic was really coming through. But yeah, it was really, I think Michelle has better answers to Scott's question than I do at this stage.
Thank you. Yeah, well, one of the things I thought also came through in Michelle's talk was this idea of, well, the Arnoldian discourse, doesn't it, comes through in ideas of what she was talking about, the feminine, a sensitivity, also this idea of second sight. There's a Neil Gunn novel called Second Sight as well, but those might also be maybe stereotypical views of the Celt or the Highlanders. I wonder if just coming back to Michelle for a moment, there's any sense of an undermining of, or a way of kind of subverting the Arnoldian discourse that you see in some of the art, in the connections between spiritualism and revivalism. I'm thinking a bit of Yeats really there, because Yeats kind of does, he plays with the same ideas in the Irish revival, but there's a kind of an attempt to undermine some of those Arnoldian ideas. Is there any kind of sense of that in Celtic revival art?
I didn't ken is the truthful answer. I haven't looked at it in too much detail yet, but I think actually maybe the answer is more in people like Andrew Lang, who kind of tap into some of these Celtic revival ideas while also being involved in the Society of Psychical Research, and that sort of clash between these sort of stereotypes, those romanticizations of the idea of the Celt, the second sight, and how some of that becomes quite difficult to handle because it doesn't quite situate itself in this modern sort of framework, which is seen as being sort of almost backwards and not quite in line with the Enlightenment rationalism that's trying to also play out. And I think that's where perhaps John Duncan is actually trying to reconcile these two camps, is trying to show through references to occult sciences that there is space for the enchanted and the disenchanted, or the enchanted and the rational. And when you kind of throw Patrick Geddes into that mix, where he's working with occultists, at the same time, those occultists and his own Celtic revivalist sort of group around him are interested in things like second sight, at the same time that the Society of Psychical Research is also trying to explain these things in very rational terms. I think it adds a really interesting complexity of, this is romantic, but at the same time incredibly scientific and very modern in terms of that scientific explanation. So I wonder if while John Duncan's trying to collapse some of that romanticization by referencing the occult sciences, at the same time he's also just building on those tropes and appropriating them into some of his visual imagery. I don't know, I think Alex probably has some more to add to that. So just thinking again about some of these ideas of rupture and sort of moving forward while also looking backwards, and how perhaps Enlightenment trends also come through within that, even though it's an earlier period.
Alex, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, just in the interest of kind of keeping the sort of discussion flowing, I mean, that's really fascinating. I think, and I'm really struck as well, Scott, by your question about Arnold. And of course, Arnold sees the Celt as disappearing. The sort of the disappearance of the Celt adds to its kind of cultural value, and maybe that's why Arnold's not a revivalism in that sense. And as you say, Yeats and Geddes and the circle around him want this to be something which is present. And I was just thinking, and this may be a slight tangent, but about J.G. Fraser, and thinking of the way that Fraser's anthropology sees magic as primitive science. And obviously that sets up a reciprocity between past and present, but very much within the kind of linear trajectory of Enlightenment conjectural thinking. And I think whether it's from mystical sources, whether it's from the influence of idealism, or just a different way of thinking about temporality, this idea of revival is treating the philosophy, the arts, the science of the past, not as as something which is present, but equally kind of informed in a way as that of the present. So it kind of undoes that. So in some ways, we might get closer to pinning down revival when we start to kind of get those contrasts going. Yeah,
Corey, you were talking at the end of your presentation about the Golden Bough, and so I wonder if you've.
Yeah, well, just as Alex was saying that there, all of Naomi Mitchison's historical novels just popped into my head. Like that's the folk magic of her work, like wherever and whenever it's set, do precisely that, but tie it to very materialistic, very materialist concerns, and a kind of vaguely Marxian notion of history as well. Just like a fascinating pairing, and one that arguably in some of the texts doesn't hold together very well, and in others really does. So it's there might make for a good study for precisely how those like late 19th century ideas about classical religion and folk customs and belief systems is used to inform the literatures of the period we're interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to come on to some of the ideas that Charlotte was playing with in her talk, because I think one of the things that came through in Charlotte's talk about excellent talk about magazines was the sense also of the Renaissance, the revival, but particularly the Renaissance doesn't own the concept of revival. One of the things I suppose we tend to think in a kind of standard sense of Scottish literary criticism is revival happens in certain places at certain times and is owned by certain people. But Charlotte, your talk kind of seemed to imply, I think importantly, that that's not necessarily the case, that there was lots of magazines disseminating different ideas of revival, in particular prior to the post-war period. I wondered when I was listening to your talk who the main readers really of many of those magazines might be. Who was reading the kind of magazines that you were talking about in your talk?
Yeah, it's always difficult to know, because unless you find someone's diary that says, oh, I really enjoyed reading the chapbook, it was great today, you don't always know. But from the titles that I kind of talked about and suggested were part of the focus of what I talked about, there's definitely two kind of strands. There's the family, trying to aim at old people and young people, trying to there are magazines that try to kind of inject themselves into Sunday reading, being acceptable and wholesome and non-threatening. And then there are also magazines that will inevitably be appealing to young people and to children at the same time, because there's always such a mix of, because you have literature that's like acceptable for adults, inevitably some of that means that it's acceptable for children too, because there's no like swear words or seedy kind of salacious content. So that's a very obvious group. And then I suppose the other readership that emerges is readership more related to the later titles that I spoke of, the kind of post-1900, slightly more politically aware magazines. And I mean, that'll be anybody, that'll be a complete barrage of people from the really politically aware and very kind of militant about sort of Scottish nationalism and early calls for independence, to the more kind of moderate liberal who's been persuaded by his friend to just have a read and see if home rule is something for him. So I kind of saw that binary like emerging, but it's by no means a helpful binary actually, because inevitably there will be people who read both or who didn't. So yeah, that's kind of two groups that is emerging, but it's not fixed.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and I thought it was interesting in relation to your talk to think about Corey's as well, because Corey, you kind of played off Scottish chapbook, which Charlotte mentions in her talk with chapbook, the folk revival magazine. So I wonder if you could talk about that just a little bit, what the relationship might be between those magazines. Is there a way of reading those magazines that tells us more about the relationship between the folk revival and the Renaissance?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. They're very, very, they're very different in like conception and intent and readership. And I was being maybe a wee bit cheeky, just pointing to the fact that they share a name, and that name's been reused in so many other contexts, and that ultimately is pointing to a sort of a popular 18th century mode of print culture. But that's I don't know, it doesn't seem accidental that some of their aims where those things overlap is about affecting a kind of very broad and vaguely defined kind of cultural revival with all the attendant problems that Alex has described, But the one thing that's fascinating about the comparison between those types of magazines is that the folk revival is not at all concerned with whether it's happening or not. it's totally comfortable with the fact that it is happening, and it's far more concerned, as I said in the presentation, about tambourines and electric guitars, but there's even interesting debates there about like the purists in the revival, Ewan MacColl being one, who was kind of resistant at people learning songs that don't belong to the postcode they've been brought up in or what have you, without careful study of that locale and background and everything, as opposed to someone like Hamish Henderson's view, which was more open to like the experimentalism of the Incredible String Band or whatever in the 70s. So there's all sorts of hot button debates, but they're like very much on the inside of this movement and already assume the sort of the groundwork of this revival around anxieties around commercialism, around accepting that some degree of it is needed to sustain itself, around the kind of compromises it's had to make with certain institutions, around lots of it is filled with pleas for the people who regularly attend these folk clubs to pay their dues and to get more actively involved. So it's like it has a sort of grassroots manifestation of actual people who are actually involved. And we're, a historian of the revival is in fact maybe better placed in terms of the difficulty Charlotte was just describing, of trying to figure out the readership of these magazines, and that there are like semi-regular reports, not least because so many of the folk that are critical to the revival are like middle-class professionals who love taking notes and keeping data on this kind of stuff, so that we can actually measure a lot of this. And so many of them are school teachers, so they're that way inclined as well, I think. But yeah, the comparison isn't when the folk revival magazines strike upon big debates, they assume a kind of environmental kind of like just baseline cultural nationalism, but they're more than happy to bring in, they're also very comfortable, with the fact that folk culture doesn't recognize national borders and moves freely across them, for instance.
Well, this brings me to back to Charlotte's kind of case study, I suppose, of Jessie Annie Anderson in her talk, in your talk, Charlotte, when you talked about her, and her view of the Scottish chapbook was it seemed to manifest a fascist bulkiness. Was that the phrase that she used? Which I thought was a fascinating phrase to use, and that she thought there was some connection in the magazine, in McDermott's magazine, to Labourism. Was this fascist bulkiness, I can't think what she means at all by that, but is this fascist bulkiness, was that her view of the Renaissance as a whole? Do you know?
Yeah, I think so. The letters, the quotation that I took that from is a bunch of letters between her and James Pittendry McGilvray, who Michael's written about, who was kind of also part of the Renaissance in the more artistic and but also wrote poetry. So there's about 4 years worth of letters between them, and it's the only insight into Jessie at all, because she left no kind of biographical or autobiographical information. It's all kind of had to be I've had to do sort of to recover her. But I think what I was trying to kind of insinuate from that letter was that she could see the Renaissance happening. She was known to McDermott, they corresponded. She also whines in that letter that she gave him one of her notebooks and he never gave it back to her. And so she keeps writing these letters to McGilvray being like, can you please ask him for my notebook back, because this is just getting ridiculous now. So she can see that it's happening and she's aware of some of the people involved in it. And then she, from what she says in these letters, also corresponds with them. But I think she's aware that her emergence as a poet and all the things that she was involved in predates this. And so the things that she has written about, the themes that she's been involved with and that she's engaged with, like the vernacular or dialect or occultism or an appreciation for the Celtic revival as well, she knows it's already happened and has lived through that. So I think fascist bulkiness kind of, in my opinion, is alluding to the idea that there's this looming presence that she's not a part of, that she's on the fringes of, but she doesn't necessarily understand why it's there, because what she says in that letter is there's always been cultural awareness in newspapers or in magazines, is what I've kind of added to that. So it kind of brought to my mind that question of, well, what was the Renaissance reviving? And then Alex's presentation is great for that kind of question, because it almost answers it there. So yeah, I love Jessie. She's great.
Don't write an article called Fascist Bulkiness with some sort of subtitle, I'll be very upset. We really need to bring the audience in. Michael, do you have any kind of questions you want to ask at this point?
Yeah, no, just I'll throw in one that I was really fascinated by was a quote in, or one of Alex's comments, that with revivalist literature or revivalist culture, quite often it can speedily turn from avant-garde to kitsch. And yeah, I just wondered if you could reflect a bit more on that, Alex. What is it that can turn revivalist art very quickly to kitsch? And then if anyone else wants to kind of chip in if they've noticed similar tendencies in the revivals they've been working on, be interesting to hear about it.
I mean, I'm probably betraying my sympathies with a particular style and a particular period of revival, but my assumption is that, you know, national cultural life is full of kitsch, of symbols which are dead and in need and circulate for commercial reasons, for all kinds of reasons, for reasons of identification, and are continually in need of kind of renewal and reactivation, and can be assigned a kind of critical, kind of powerful force, and that for obvious political reasons, art will continue to reach for that, and that's a very powerful thing. But that around revival, because of that idea of the archaic force that you're kind of tapping into, whether it's the sort of specific authority of a traditional feature, as soon as it's tied to nation, then you get that kind of rapid decline into kitsch. And again, I think Michelle's presentation was really helpful for me in kind of teasing that out a little bit, because I think, you know, a McDermidite, I suppose, that's always been my initial reaction to the 1880, 1890s revival. But that sense that there's almost a conscious reclaiming of a different account of the Celtic, a different account of that. It's an intervention within the sort of the field of national symbols. And obviously those are, and I see we've got a great question in the comment, which is in the Q&A, which is touching on this, that's always going to be a diverse and heterogeneous and conflicted field. So there's always going to be that fight for possession of national symbols, but that has to be a fight to reactivate and give them power. Otherwise it's just, you know, shilling, you know, for money.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Respond to that, sorry.
Sorry, Mike, I'll across you there. I think we could come to our audience questions now and bring some of these in. I'll read out a question from Kate Mathis. And Kate says, my question speaks to Dr. Thomson's excellent presentation, but also to the network's timely endeavour in hoping to redefine revival in a Scottish context. Scottish revival within Fantasecular movements more widely, many of which involved minoritized languages. I was interested by the suggestion that in order to herald a successful revival, the present must be portrayed as a site of failed tradition in need of renewal, and in how that rather delicate concept, clearly open to cultural appropriation, might be complicated when the failed tradition involves a culture and language that's been deliberately suppressed. It's notable here how the terms Scottish, Celtic and Highland are being used almost interchangeably, but actually represent hugely differing sites of tradition and language still in threatened use within Scotland's marginalised communities, in which the power imbalance remains vivid as a lengthy historical basis still highly relevant in the 20th century. Thank you for your comment or question there, Kate. So I suppose part of that's about how we think about revival out with non-English speaking or even non-Scots, but in a Gaelic kind of perspective as well. Anyone got any kind of thoughts on that? Perhaps Corey, you might have thoughts on that from a kind of folk revival perspective in terms of kind of threatened communities or marginalized communities?
Yeah, it's The difficulty with trying to speak to these kinds of like really pressing and important political questions when it comes to the folk revival is that it was so kind of under theorized by its practitioners, with the like exception of Hamish Henderson. So I just like lean on him all the time with this stuff. But he certainly was reportedly had a bit of Gaelic. I think it was a bit ropey in places, to be honest, and maybe a bit lumpy when he tried to write or transcribe things. But he was certainly aware of that dynamic, and it was important to his sort of precepts for what the revival was or should be or could be. But he also had something of that framework for the whole project, that it was about, and this is where stuff as far back as like Jane Ellen Harrison's work on the study of Greek classical religion comes in, is that he thinks the folk, the chthonic underground of folk culture is the bedrock of everything, and it's unknowable, and you only get little flavors of it here and there, but it is the foundation for all literary arts, and that is equivalent to and kind of based on, in a way, the relationship between like chthonic ritual practices and classical Greek religion in its higher forms. That relationship is equivalent to the one between folk culture and literary arts in modern Scotland, is how he sees it. And so it is always already suppressed because it is inherently subaltern. And this is what worried him when he discovered Gramsci's work, which says that because that's true, folk culture is by its nature a sort of apolitical force, in that it's adaptable. It can, as it so happens, under late capitalism in Scotland, it is or can be a revolutionary left-wing kind of populist kind of force. But were we ever to get the revolution we want, then it will still be there and it'll be a reactionary force. And so like these are the kinds of like contradictions that he tried to wrestle out and never quite resolved. And again, that's why I think he's sort of useful and interesting there. So that kind of strategic suppression is part of his project there. And he fell out with historian Edward Cowan about this kind of stuff as well. The degree to which, for instance, the fact of the suppression of Scottish folk culture, according to Henderson, is down to the Reformation or not. And, Ted Cowan pushes back and suggests that, well, actually, it produced a lot of folk culture as well. So these are the kinds of like debates he's having all the way throughout in the historical sphere, but also in the like urgent kind of present of the folk revival, tied to things like the anti-Polaris demonstrations or nationalist causes at the time in the post-war period.
Thank you. We've got another question which is in the chat, which I think is interesting, and probably kind of going to throw it out to all of you. I'm not quite sure who it's from, forgive me, but it says, how much of an impact did the interwar literary renaissance have at the time it was happening, and how did that compare to the impact it later had in the 1960s and 70s when it was revived in the mind of a subsequent generation of writers? This kind of reminds me of some of the ideas that Alex was playing with, that revival seems to be a kind of constant and something that kind of constantly pushes towards the present. But also kind of reminds me of something that Corey said when in his talk, when he said that he thought the folk revival had been more successful in its own terms than the Renaissance might have been. But any thoughts on this question? How successful was the Renaissance? How would we define what successful might be, in fact, in relation to Renaissance? What does that mean? So anyone got any thoughts on that? Alex?
So I mean, a couple of, it's a really great question. As I should just say, as was Kate Mathis's question, I think that's a really fascinating and urgent, point for the project to kind of follow up on. And I think it would require a sort of socioeconomic supplement to the kind of analysis I'm proposing. But just on the impact of the Renaissance, so my take on this is that it doesn't have as much impact as it wants, obviously, but that's kind of built into its logic, because one of the things that McDermott insists on is that Renaissance is not just having some Scottish novelists, that might be part of it, but it is the kind of complete, total spiritual revolution that he wants to see. And in that sense, it taps back into that idealist utopian streak, as well as to his own many-mindedness, depending on where he's writing and when. And I think a fuller periodization and analysis of that would be really helpful. For my money, the key impact is not actually in the 60s and 70s, but is in the immediate post-war period. So my view is that the Renaissance doesn't have the impact that its key impact is in the that it is talked about more than it is actually read. And so I see the creation of a distinctive Scottish literary sphere as taking place in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And that's the space which can then be contested by subsequent waves of writers. So there's a kind of overthrow of Renaissance in it. And I think that's in some sense a tremendously dangerous feature. It's a hugely misogynist, I mean, it's structurally misogynist, the post-war sphere. It's all about poetry and not about novels, whereas we know that the pre-war Renaissance has a very different vibe. So there are real problems there, but it's also a kind of an enabling matrix for what I think is where we are now. And there's been a tendency in recent literary history to write that period out. It kind of becomes the hangover from the 20s and 30s, or the kind of the rubbish bit, which the 60s comes in, and sex happens and people start taking drugs and writing about that. But the integrity of that period and all the problems that come with it, I think, is really critical. And I actually, I want to go back to many conversations I've had with Corey about this, because I think between us we could triangulate this and really make it work.
Thank you, Alex. We've got another question, a question for Alex. It says, someone who studies Welsh cultural revivalism from around 1750, I want to push a little on the idea of the distinctiveness of modernist revival as distinct from romantic revival, being reviving culture as an integrated whole rather than reviving individual traditions. Clearly, culture is a more developed idea by the late 19th century, but in earlier Romantic era Welsh revivalism, I frequently see revivalists wishing to revive what we would now call a national culture, expressed through ideas like national genius or national spirit, etc., for example, via the revived Eisteddfod movement. I wonder if the distinctiveness of modernist revival has to be found elsewhere. That's addressed to Alex, but so Alex first, but if anyone else, particularly our Celtic revivalists here, have thoughts on that, welcome to.
I mean, that may well be the bias of my perspective coming from the Scottish situation, because I think there it is possible to see a clear distinction between this period of revival and what happens in the 18th century, which, as you say, the ideas of national genius, national spirit are certainly coming to the fore, and in some sense fertilize this project. But because it's tied to a kind of distinct trajectory of progress, it sort of doesn't take in that sense. And I think that's where comparative analysis will become critical to us being able to triangulate and understand what's different in Scottish culture. So I totally, accept that there may be a mistake here, but I feel that there is definitely a difference in the Scottish context. And again, my worry about this is partly, again, my bias is showing I like discontinuity. It helps me think, and my sense is that the revival of Scottish romanticism has tended to sort of pour glue over our ability to kind of understand how all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle should actually be slotted together, and they produce a kind of a continuity born from the point at which the modern nation is born.
I wondered when I was listening to your talk, Alex, about how much national specificity matters, really, and in terms of your thinking about revival being a kind of constant, but also a kind of failed constant as well, in a sense. I wondered whether there's a sense in which different national cultures like the Irish revival, or even movements like the Harlem Renaissance, where the acknowledged position is that they have some impact on the social sphere. The Harlem Renaissance has always been understood as influencing the civil rights movement, for instance, in positive ways. How do we kind of think about that in relation to Scotland, where perhaps the senses of the Renaissance as being a kind of failed project in those terms? But I think you're right that comparative analysis, world analysis, I think is very important.
And it may just be that Scotland doesn't have a revival, that it actually has a strong national tradition instead, and that there's a perspective distortion which has repeatedly occurred in the 20th century, where people have wanted to narrate that in terms of revival for certain benefits. And again, that would go back to Kate's question, that there's actually a really critical difference between the revival of a minority linguistic group or a minority culture within the context of a larger threatening entity, and what we're talking about in relation to the Scottish nation. But I'm getting onto, you know, contestable political territory at that point, but yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. We're going to have to draw things to a close, I'm afraid. There's so many issues, questions that we could have, but our time has run out. If, as audience members, you're happy for us to contact you about future events, please just type that into the chat. Just say, please contact me, and we'll stay in touch about future events. Our next event will happen in the autumn. We don't have a fixed date yet. We'll be in touch soon to tell you when that will be. And that's titled From Revival to Renaissance. And that's discussions that will chart the link between the late Victorian period of the Celtic Revival and the modernism of the subsequent Scottish Renaissance period. We'll have panelists, Juliet Shields, who will talk about uncanonical Scottish female writers in revival, on which she's just published an EUP book. Professor Juliet Shields, Professor Glenda Norkey, who will talk about Robert Louis Stevenson and revival, and Robert Louis Stevenson in the Renaissance. Dr. Andrew Nash, who will talk about publishing, revival and Renaissance, and Dr. Ariana Antrona, who will talk about the imperial fiction of the Victorian period and the imperial connections of the Renaissance, particularly in relation to Violet Jacob. So I think there'll be fantastic talks. I think there were fantastic talks preceding this panel today. So thank you very much again to our speakers. And thank you so much to all of you who have come along. Please keep a lookout for our next event, and we welcome you to that. So thank you. Bye-bye.